Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM, Channel 141. This is the Insight segment. I'm Harold Fisher. At a time when so many workers are feeling anxious, devalued, and simply burned out, how do you turn that workplace pain into purpose? We're talking about workplace resilience, what it really takes to bounce back and to protect your well-being on the job. Tonight, we will hear from two experts who know all too well about workplace stress, and we will also spotlight an upcoming forum designed to help employees heal, refocus, and rise, not just survive, but thrive in the workplace. My guests are Dr. Anita Plummer, Associate Professor and Executive Director of the Howard University Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership. Also, Madia Logan, Founder and Chief Brand Officer of Logan PR. Ladies, thank you so much for joining the conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Let me first talk about where we are. This is day 16 of the federal government shutdown. We already have high tension in the workplace for those who still have their jobs. Certainly, money is an issue. There are a great deal of feelings of uncertainty for those who are still on the job, those who are at home. Talk to us, if you can, about the range of emotions that workers are going through right now, Anita.
So indeed, with the furloughs and the budget cuts across the board, two issues come to mind immediately, and they're measurable. One is that anytime there is an interruption in income, stress spikes. So even a short pay gap increases the financial strain and insecurity that not only individuals but families experience. So we already know that women report higher rates of stress. So imagine losing your job. And then my second point is the uncertainty of knowing when you'll be able to return. So you can imagine sleepless nights. You can imagine wondering, okay, my bills are continuing. How am I going to pay my bills? And then when you return back to work, the backlog that you have to deal with, right? So the impact is definitely broad. It's not just individual fatigue, individual pain. It's familial and community pain and hurt.
Talk to me about, and this is actually for both of you, how would you define, first of all, workplace pain? Give me a little context, Anita, if you will.
I think we've all experienced it. So I can speak for myself. Generally, when we think about stressors, things that actually cause stress, it tends to impact us physically. Again, we ruminate even though the workday is over. We lose sleep. Our hearts begin to race. There's a physiological impact when we feel stress. And that doesn't even include the emotional impact that stress has on us. So for many of us, it's both physical and it's mental, and everyone experiences it differently. People tend to disengage from work. They're not as motivated when they feel burnt out. That's another term that folks use for exhaustion. And that impacts productivity. A lot of us have our sense of purpose defined by what we do. We are always asked, the first question, what is it that you do for a living?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, our identities are intertwined in what we do. So when we lose that focus, when we lose that motivation because we're exhausted or burnt out, sometimes we lose our identities and we pay the health consequences for that too.
Madia, you were nodding your head at what Anita was sharing. Your thoughts about that?
Well, one, I experienced a lot of what she's talking about personally. And so it's interesting because as we're talking about it, it's reminding me of kind of being in that place. But I also am working on this event, this Work Hurt to Healing event. And we define work hurt as the silent injuries that professionals carry from toxic workplaces and fractured systems, resulting in broken trust, disengagement, and the erosion of fairness. These wounds directly impact resilience, performance, and long-term career success.
Hmm. So when you look at your career, you have worked in the in the corporate realm. You've also worked for governmental agencies. When you talk about your own personal experience, did it matter whether it was private industry or public service?
I honestly don't think it did. I think it's layered. I think it's deeply layered for all of us. Our wellness in the workplace relates to our health. I was laid off 5 years ago, and I was dealing with severe burnout. So in that time, in that space, I got to redefine how I wanted to work. I got to, distribute and really build different streams of income. And so for me, it was about personally stepping back and getting well, and then stepping back in with my plan and strategy to move ahead and to not burn out.
Anita, workplace resilience, that term suggests to me that you have to be ready to fight, to use a biblical reference, to put on the whole armor of God when you go in. And can we have a moment from audio? Yeah. But, I've always said, work is work. And is there a difference between work, in your mind, work versus, career resilience? I mean, some people are just going in there, punching the clock. Others have fully involved careers, as you said, that are identifiable with who you are. But why must we be resilient in the workplace? Why can't the workplace be welcoming?
That is a very good question. So I just want to say we have to couple resilience with resistance. We've been conditioned to be resilient. We hold exhaustion as it's a badge of honor. We're taught always to lean in. I was taught to always say yes to all things all of the time. I was conditioned to be resilient from a very young age. Rest was a luxury. Rest was seen as me being lazy. Like, this is what I was conditioned to believe. So this idea of resilience being our superpower is very problematic. I think this is an identity that we have to contend with as women generally, and we have to shed that identity and create our own individual identities outside of this resilience framework. So what do I mean by resistance? You've mentioned some of the things. Resisting, stereotypes and myths is one. Resisting this myth that I have to be all things to all people. Because yes, we're talking about the 9-to-5 paid work, but we haven't started talking about caregiving work and unpaid labor, right? We also need to resist cultures that are toxic within the workplace.
Give me an example of that.
So one example is, booking back-to-back meetings and saying yes to my manager all of the time, instead of saying, you know what, I need a time block for me to do the tasks that you assigned the day before. I need some empty time blocks where I'm not meeting, right? Or I'm not going to have, and this is a luxury, I'm not going to have my work email associated with my personal phone. Right? I'm not going to look at my email when I'm having dinner with my kids. These small acts of resistance are a form of reclamation and a form of us being whole beings and not just being workers. And again, it's very individualized. It's very individual. What may work for me may not work for another person, but we have to hold institutions accountable because we're producing for institutions. Institutions need us. Right? It's okay, to ask for that time, for rest, for healing. And the event this week is a space for us to learn the language. How do we talk to each other about these issues? How do we talk to our managers about these issues? What are these little acts of resistance that we can practice, individually, so we can begin to shed that resilience framework or mindset that we've been conditioned to carry?
I do want to talk about that more in depth, but I do want to talk about this event that's happening next week. And I think this is really important to really understand what you're trying to, achieve. This event is called Work, Hurt to Healing, a forum on workplace resilience. Tell me more about what you're hoping will come out of this, Madia, and the when, the where, and how people can participate.
Yeah. Well, Work Hurt to Healing is really about helping people reconnect with their peace and purpose after they've been through burnout or inequity or a loss. And it's not therapy, it's about strategy and support. So the goal is to give people tools, community, and language to help support them in their healing journey and leading from wholeness. So we're really focused on healing in this environment, but from the sense where we're giving people tools, community, and language.
Mm-hmm. It's next week. It's October 23rd.
Yes.
Give me the rundown for that, please.
You can learn more on the website WHUR-FM, or you can go right to the Eventbrite page, which is workhurt.eventbrite.com, and see the full itinerary, what we have planned.
Okay, and it's from 2 to 4 in the afternoon, the Lewis Stokes Health Science Library, which is, you can see it right there from Bryant Street on the campus of Howard University. And by the way, it is workhurt.co, not .com.
Thank you. Yes.
But .co. I mean, people may assume that it's a typo, but no, it is workhurt.co. And you do have to register, correct?
Yes.
Now, here's the other question. This is Howard University Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership. Will the men have to stand outside, Anita? Or?
Absolutely not. Oh my gosh. Absolutely not. Transformational leadership takes our entire community. Change takes our entire community. So at the center, we have both men and women students who are engaged. We have an open door policy. We see our struggles intertwined and interlinked. So absolutely, the entire community is invited.
Okay. Yeah. Certainly always important to know. But I think to this point, and I'll ask you this, and we can continue also, on the other side. You made a really interesting point, Anita, where you said organizations, corporations, whomever we are working for, they need us. Okay. But how do you balance that they need us with the pushback of whether or not they need you? Because you spoke also about work culture and how you were taught. And so I'm sure you heard growing up the same thing that my parents said, you better get that job and keep that job.
Yes.
So, and so whatever your supervisor tells you to do, resistance, to use a Star Trek reference, resistance is futile. And so how do you address that in the workplace, particularly if you are of the millennial working generation, where we have seen them more readily able to push back as opposed to the Gen Zs or the Gen Xers and the like. We're going to talk about all of that because it has to be a strategy. You just can't say, no, I'm not going to do that. We will get into all of that after we take this very, very short break. We want to remind you that you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Inside segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR-FM. This conversation continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our discussion about surviving and thriving in the workplace. All of this ahead of next week's Work, Hurt to Healing, a forum on workplace resilience. It's happening at the Louis Stokes Health Sciences Library at Howard University. My guests are Dr. Anita Plummer, Associate Professor and Executive Director of the Howard University Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership, and Madia Logan, Founder and Chief Brand Officer of Logan PR. I want to go back to the point that I was making before the break, Anita. As I said, it's one thing to talk about having a more holistic, encompassing Zen attitude on the job, but that is a relatively new way, I think, of thinking, because as we were saying before, we were raised go to work, get it done, and come home.
That's right. That's
How
right.
do you where is that strategic resistance that we were
Yes.
talking about?
So that's complicated because institutions are complicated. People's positions within institutions and organizations are, different. And I think that's where this event, I think, is going to be particularly useful. This event is a space for people to come together and ask those questions. What strategies are people using in these forms of micro resistance for their own self-sustainability, so to speak? This idea of micro communities for accountability, I think, become very important. Are women in particular talking to each other? Or do we feel that we're islands in isolation, experiencing these things on our own? Just being able to talk through some of our experiences in the workplace is a powerful starting point. At this event next week, we'll also learn about resources available to women in different stages of their career. Of course, students are going to be there, alumni are going to be there. I think it's also important to ensure that you're right, it is a generational question.
Yeah.
People of different generations experience, workplaces differently, and they use their voices differently. And I think the younger generation has some things coming down the pike, which I think is going to add an extra stressor with AI, for example. What is the perfect employee look like in the age of technology when we're going to have to compete now with computers, in the workplace? I think these are all issues that collectively we have to tackle with. With that said, in terms of rest, we can't view rest as a reward. I think that's just one small step. Rest should not be a reward, right? Taking a break, watching something on television, just sitting back and putting my feet up I have small kids, running around, right? I shouldn't have to earn that. That should be a given. So this type of self-talk and these micro actions that we take, those are small steps. And yes, institutions do need to change. And that's where models of leadership need to be discussed. How can we change how leaders interact with managers? As Black women in leadership positions, how can we model empathy? How can we model different accountability? This is what we try to do at the Women's Center. We want to present our students with alternative models of operating through these spaces, so we're not passive, right? Yeah.
Well, so there's so many questions I have with that. So at Logan PR, Madia is the boss. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So is yours a one woman shop, or do you have people who work for you?
I have people that work with me. And when people ask me the skinny on my company, I say I make a lot less money than I did when I was in corporate America, but the boss really gets me. And that's important to me. So that is a conscious trade-off. And I've began to diversify my income streams. So I have less dependence on that 40-hour a week job and more focused on the satisfaction around the job I'm doing and being precise about who I work with and the roles that I take on.
So one of the things when I talk about how careers, particularly corporate, has evolved, and we've even seen this in pop culture. I don't know whether or not either one of you are familiar with the dramatic series Billions on HBO back in 2016. Yes, a billionaire, a multi-billion hedge fund. They had an in-house counselor.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to say how real that is, but I would imagine that for high-end corporates, yeah, they can afford to do that. But I guess another version of that is EAPs, for example, in employee assistance programs, which we have seen, which when I got out of college and got into TV news, there was no such thing. And I think so that is one of the, I think, cultural changes, Anita, that we have seen. But I will also say this, there are some jobs that in high deadline jobs, again, I use the news business, but it could be anything, corporate consulting, where you don't have the option not to attend the back-to-back meetings. I talked to a friend of mine yesterday, hadn't spoken to in a while, and I called her at 11 a.m. And she sent me a text and said, "I'll call you. I'm in a meeting." And I texted her at noon, still in a meeting. I called her at 3, still in a meeting.
Yes.
I don't know if it was the same or back to back. And my thing was, all I wanted to know was, how's your husband doing? Because he's recovering from cancer. I can't get that, because as you were saying, how do you resist that?
That's very difficult. But you know what tends to happen is, and it happens with women, I think it also happens with men too. There's something called the caregiver's cliff. And I experienced this. I had invested over a decade into my career. I waited. I decided to have my first child, and it was quite overwhelming. I didn't take leave. I had administrative responsibilities. I had community responsibilities. I had responsibilities at home. And let me tell you, I understand why so many women leave the workforce. Why? Because they're burnt out. Why? Because there's this unreasonable expectation that you can't have a break from all these back-to-back meetings. So this is a real issue, and it's an issue for individuals and families, but it's this profound economic issue too. When women with institutional memory, with innovation, with profound talent that they invested decades into cultivating, leave the workforce because either they have children or they're caring for aging parents, right? So it's on both ends. That impacts, our economy generally, but that's what many people are faced with. Why? Because corporations don't want to step back, and institutions, in organizations, it's not just companies, right? Don't want to step back and say, okay, how can we make this more sustainable? right? How can we ensure that there are, some breaks for people, that it's not always you're on your grind, you're on your grind. And we're just culturally not at that point yet where we won't sacrifice these very, highly successful, mostly women who've invested so much. It's almost as if it's acceptable that they leave the workforce because they're just burnt out.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and to your point, I've heard this over the course of my career in news meetings where news director, especially new ones, they will come in and they will say, these are my expectations, blah blah blah, and they say, and if you do not feel that you can meet the requirements, you are free to leave.
Yeah.
It's
hard.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's very hard. And even as workplaces, whether it's corporate, whether it's for profit, commercial, whether it's nonprofit or what have you, everyone still, has a goal. And Madia, certainly the world has changed in the workplace, and people are starting, I think, to pay attention. But I still think there is the kind of the professional sports mentality. If you get hurt on the field, somebody else is going to step in for you, and they're going to put you on, injured reserve. Allow my limited sports reference, and somebody else. If you don't, somebody else will.
I mean, that's true anyway. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen people have medical events at their desk and not come back to work.
Right.
And I've seen that desk be filled in a couple of weeks. And so exposure and understanding of what the actual trade-offs are that you're making to be in these spaces, right? Really understanding and making a conscious trade-off. I know that I make less money now, but I get to walk my son to his bus stop the first thing in the morning. That's important to me.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is worth taking a little bit of a pay cut so that I can do that for my, for my son, for my family. So I think it's really complicated. And for me, as a person who, I started out in nonprofits and then I went into business school and went into corporate America. And I did that as a sacrifice for my family. I did that because I wanted to help my family. I wanted to go get the money and do what we needed to do. And when I really asked myself that question 5 years ago, I took a voluntary layoff. So I was prepared to walk away and face those economic consequences because I felt like I needed to get myself together.
Mm-hmm.
I was just spinning. I tell people, I felt like I was just in a cartwheel that was on fire and I couldn't stop myself. I needed that break. So if somebody says, hey, if you get up, somebody else is going to take your seat. Let them have it, was my thought. They can have it, and they can have all of the harm that comes along with it. And I'm going to go balance out my life and figure out what I want and shoot for that.
When you talk about resilience, not resistance, but resilience, Anita, and even that dreaded word, self-care. If I see that phrase one more time, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it obviously is a real thing, not just for women, I think but for everyone. If you can't do it at work, how might you be able to do it once you leave work at the end of any given day?
Yeah, I think I can speak for myself in terms of what I need to do to unplug.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's spending time with my family, not without the television on, without the radio on. It's just me in a room with my family, generally cooking and just spending time with them and valuing that time. But let me tell you, that came at a cost. I felt so much guilt with my children, in the first years of their lives because I was working so much. I worked so much. I'm tenured now, but I was working toward tenure. I was so stressed out that when I got to a point where I was able to cook them a meal and not think about all of the other tasks I had to do, it was such a relief.
Mhm.
And that was just so simple, right? Being able to prepare a dinner for my family and enjoy it. And it shouldn't be that way. Let me just tell you, that should just be a given. But finding safe spaces, whether it's in a faith community, right? Whether it's, singing or dancing, carving out for me now it's going to the gym. I have to find time to go to the gym because what we haven't talked about are the health impacts of burnout,
Let's do
like
that.
the health costs, right?
Yeah.
So there's a cost to all of this, to this grind that we're buying into because we have to. Our families rely on us, right? I mean, when I go to the doctor now, I'm tested for high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, and now cortisol levels. Now my doctor wants cortisol levels. Why? Because that's linked to stress.
Mm-hmm.
She asked, "What's your education level?" Right? How many hours? So she's asking questions linked to stress, and I have to get cortisol tests. And I didn't know what it meant. I had to do research. Why? Because the physiological impacts of burnout and stress.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like a light went off in my head. But we know the statistics about heart disease in women. It's now the number one killer. And stress is linked to that.
Mm-hmm. Maria, does it, and I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, sometimes we put the onus on the jobs to make sure that they provide an atmosphere and a culture that is healthier. But as you said, taking that voluntary layoffs, sometimes every job just isn't for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to sometimes you have to make a decision that, to Anita's point, is good for your health.
Yeah, that's very true. I'll just add, in the 5 years since I left, I had an amazing health discovery. We have a nutritionist that's going to be at the event, at the Work Hurt to Healing event, because that is so foundational, because your health and your well-being, that is so essential to your well-being. But I had this amazing find of a food allergy that I did not know that I had. And I've been in the workforce for 25 years. But a part of what was compounding my particular stress was having that stomach problem and not knowing when it was going to kick up. And now that I know that I have a gluten intolerance, I just stay away from it. So when you learn yourself, when you get that healing plan, when you start to work towards, you can really build specific coping mechanisms that help you deal with what you have to face in the outside world, to help you balance out things for yourself. There were things I had to stop doing. There were things I had to stop eating, right? And then, I saw relief so quickly. So now that I have that relief, I feel I could go back into that environment if I wanted to, right? If that was a choice that I wanted to make. But my health and my discovery of that food allergy was such a discovery for me. So at this event, one of the breakout sessions, you can go and meet with this nutritionist, and she's going to talk about general health, but she's also going to talk about how it's personal for you and how you have to learn, what your body needs and do that. So as self-care, as we use self-care so much, I know what you were saying, because it's like saturation. But what is real self-care? For me, it looks like having a cheesesteak on top of fries instead of with the bread. so I don't get sick later, right? For you, right, it may be dinner with the family. For you, Harold, it might be, a yoga practice that you have. But we have to find those coping mechanisms that help us kind of deal with the world as it is and fight for the world as it should be. But how do we cope day to day? What are our coping mechanisms, and what do we need specifically?
Yeah.
And
As a Philadelphia native that you are, Madia, I think that cheesesteak on fries is sacrilege. You're going to have to explain that to your family and friends. So we may have to beep that out, but
Quick edit, quick edit.
yeah, we'll edit that part out. Go ahead, Anita. You were about
Oh,
to.
I just want to say, I actually respond the same way you do to self-care and also work-life balance. I'm like, what does that even mean? So I
Mhm.
like the idea of mutual care. And I think that's what this space is about. It's like we're trying to work through these issues together. We don't have it figured out. There's a lot happening, both within us and without. There's a lot that we're dealing with that's almost unprecedented. And we don't have all the answers, but this idea of mutual care means that collectively we can arrive at, some peace, together. We may not understand everything. That's another question. We may not
Mhm.
understand everything that's happening in the world, but maybe we can find some solace collectively. And I also want to say that, when we're on the grind, we tend to ignore the pain that we're in, and
Mhm.
ignoring pain doesn't make it go away. It just compounds and multiplies. So we have to definitely make interventions when we feel that pain,
Mhm.
right? Because if we don't, it's going to continue to eat us up, and we're not going to be able to thrive. Or individually, I know I can't thrive and I can't fully live, and I can't be a great mom. I can't be a great professor if, I'm grieving. And I think this space allows us, to say, okay, I'm grieving about these things, about what's happening in the world, or, I'm still grieving from the COVID lockdowns, to be honest with you. I'm still working through this with my students, and it's okay to just talk about it. I think that's the first step, is just talking about it.
Mm. I think it is also important that organizations need to pay attention. And the reason I say that, a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who's in the medical field left one job that was stressful and went to an geriatric oncology center. and and I think in the back of my head, uh, there was stress that was foretold for that. And eventually, after working there for 3 months, she said to me that this place is depressing.
Mhm.
She said because very few of the patients here survive, and to the point about this conversation, the doctors and the managers did nothing for the staff to have them address this issue. It was a conveyor belt of treatment and counseling for the patients, but nothing for those who were serving the patients. This could be an issue in big city police departments. This could be an issue for people who work in funeral homes. This could be an issue in even in my business, where the world comes to an end every day and puts itself back together the next day. And so what would you say, Madia, that you have seen organizations do, big or small, to improve the the work culture?
Oh, I think that that's really about engagement and measurement. So I was a part of I won't speak, I'll speak in more general terms, but I was a part of a workforce survey team for a big corporation. And just seeing the intention that we put behind looking at the employee experience, understanding it, measuring it, and then building teams to help improve on certain things, that heartened me, just to know there's certain things that I feel are my responsibility, certain things I feel are my employers. Now, when you talked about the employee resource program, we use that a great deal. I used that a great deal. That was something that was very attractive to me. But in that environment, knowing that there was some organization and some measurement around understanding what we were experiencing as employees, and that we were empowered as a survey team to go out and think about how we could improve on things, bring that back to the company and share that in a meaningful way with leaders that had, open ears, I think, and availability. So having been a part of that, I think when large companies make it a goal to understand and to improve on, they will. But it's about researching and understanding that. Understanding that if you're looking to go in as an employee, understanding what's available, to you resource wise from the corporation, and then using it, because there's so much that was available to me that I didn't use. That I could have taken all of this time off. I came back when my son was 6 weeks old. Why? Nobody forced me to do that. But something in my head, like Dr. Plummer was talking about, something in my head told me, oh, Madia, you got to do this. Get back in there, champ. Nobody needed me at that big 100,000 person corporation. My son probably needed me more,
Right. Yeah. And I think sometimes, Anita, and I'll have you have the final word. Sometimes you don't need gummy bears and cotton candy and chair massages. Sometimes you need attitudes on the job where when you can see that, Anita is having a particularly rough day, that it is okay for your manager, your dean, since you are, a professor in this case, where they can say, go home. And I think that kind of approach, and there's a difference between, well, do you think you need to go home? No, it's go home. And we're fine with that. And instead of you leaving at 6 o'clock, you get to go home at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and brave the stressful traffic and get home whenever you get home, and sit in that silence for a few hours because you needed that. And I think sometimes, like I said, it may not be gluten-free pretzels in the vending machine, but it is an overall attitude from the bosses. Your final thoughts, Anita?
That's right. So it comes from the top, but it also comes from below. I think each of us need to see ourselves as leaders within the workplace, whether you're an administrative assistant or you're an executive director. And with that leadership, we have to know when we need to take a rest, right? When we need to ask for help, and when we need to rebuild the culture. And I really think next week's event is an opportunity for all of us to see ourselves in each of these conversations, and where we can just unpack some of these questions, and we can imagine a new type of leadership and a new type of culture for the next generation, because they're going to be Howard University students there. So yes, it's going to be practical, but also I want us to reimagine what workplace culture can be, because cultures are changing. We now have workplace leave, right? My husband took, I think, 12 weeks. I didn't take that. He took 12 weeks. That's a step in the right direction. And I was happy he had that, because he needed that. So cultures can change, because the students at Howard University, they're the ones that are going to be working in those leadership positions, and they need to know how to do right by people.
Well, again, it is Work Hurt to Healing, a forum on workplace resilience. It's next Thursday, October 23rd from 2 to 4. If you would like to participate, men and women, you can register at workhurt.co. That's workhurt.co. Thank you both so very much, Dr. Anita Plummer, Madia Logan. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Sure thing. That is the Daily Drum for this Thursday, October 16th. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.